So let's revisit the intrinsic and instrumental distinction. So if we talk about environmental ethics, the idea of intrinsic value is that nature has value in and of itself, independent of our uses for it. If we say that nature has instrumental value, we're saying that nature has value in as much as it is useful to us in one of many possible ways. So recreational value, medicinal value, resource value, etc. Now, when we talk about instrumental value, we can talk about aesthetic value as an instrumental value, although we might think of an aesthetic value really as an intrinsic value instead. It depends on about how you think about aesthetics. So remember, aesthetics is about beauty. Often we think of beauty as being something that's in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is something that's subjective. And if beauty is just something that's subjective, beauty is just instrumental value. It's something that's useful. But we might think of beauty as something that's really there in the object itself. And if that's the case, we could say that if nature is beautiful, nature has intrinsic value in that sense. Mountains, prairies, beautiful wildlands just are beautiful, and that beauty is a kind of intrinsic value. Now, there are some other ways to think about intrinsic value as well. So just to cover a few of these. So some of these come from specifically religious points of view. So if you take the Judeo-Christian tradition as an example, and we could include Islam here as well. If you look at the Jewish and Christian Bible, the first book of the Bible is the book of Genesis, and the first chapter of Genesis is about the creation of the world. And there begins that famous line, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." And then it goes on to tell us about each stage of the creation. And several times in that passage, it ends with the proclamation, "And it was good." So for Jews and Christians, there is this essential goodness to creation. There's this goodness to the way the world is, that the world is a reflection of what God has intended. Now, if we go a bit further down in that chapter 1 to verse 26, we get to the creation of human beings, and human beings are described as being in the image of God, and then it's linked in many translations to this word dominion. Human beings are given dominion over the earth. And this has been an issue of controversy and think about environmental ethics and history of Christianity, because some have taken that language of dominion to say that human beings just rule over the earth. We're allowed to do with it whatever we want. But biblical scholars have suggested really a different kind of interpretation, that if you look at the original Hebrew behind that translation of dominion, the original Hebrew has this connotation of stewardship, of responsibility for. And so humankind, from a Jewish, Christian, and also Muslim perspective, has this responsibility for creation. It's not something to just use as something out of our whim, but something that we're to care for as sort of regents for God. Now, that's a specifically religious point of view, and indeed specifically theistic point of view. A second line of thought comes from those who identify with the movement called deep ecology. So if we use that label, deep ecology, notice what is being said there, that the folks who appeal to deep ecology saying, well, we're not just ecologists. So an ecologist is a scientist who studies ecology. A deep ecologist wants to talk more about our connection to the environment. So an example of a deep ecologist is the Norwegian thinker Arne Næss, who has written extensively on this. And what Næss argues is that when we think about ethics, what we have to realize is that we have this intrinsic connectedness to everything around us. And so if I think of myself as a self, I have to realize that I, as a self, am connected to others. And so we might think about that in terms of people, first of all, that there are people that I am connected to, and I wouldn't be me except for those other people. And you might think about that, your parents, your siblings, your friends, those influential teachers growing up, all of those people influenced you and made you who you are. And similarly with the environment, Ness would say that the environment is part of us. There is no absolute divide between me and you, and between me and the environment. And so there's a sense in which destroying the environment is destroying a piece of who you are. And so a kind of intuitive way to think about this is perhaps to think about where you grew up and the wild areas, and we might say wild areas such as they were for you, that you were connected to. And what would it mean for you if those wild areas were destroyed? If those particular, or perhaps that particular tree that you climbed was destroyed. That's a connection between you and the environment that suggests that the distinction between human beings and the rest of the world is not so clear. That we're in this interconnected web, and our survival depends on the survival of the environment, and who we are depends upon the environment we live in. Right, now that's the second perspective, what's known as the deep ecology perspective, and actually that's just a slice of it. A third perspective, and this really overlaps with the previous two, but we can label as a third perspective, comes from the very famous environmental thinker Aldo Leopold, who is widely regarded as really in some ways the first environmentalist, although there's certainly plenty of people who preceded him. Leopold worked in the Forest Service, and in particular Wisconsin, but in other places as well, in the first half of the 20th century, pretty much. And he wrote this very famous work called Sand County Almanac. And the Sand County Almanac is this really extended meditation about our connection to the environment. And if you read the Sand County Almanac, easily the first half is very much descriptions of his own interactions with the environment, both as a professional forester and also in occupations like hunting. And in the later portions he gets a bit more philosophical, and there's a very famous essay of his called The Land Ethic. And in The Land Ethic he kind of lays out an argument for preservation. Some of the arguments he gives there are instrumental arguments. We need to take care of the environment because if we don't, harm can come to us as human beings. But he also wants to go much further than that. He begins by suggesting that there's a process of moral evolution at work. So in the past, it was acceptable to have slaves, and in the past it was acceptable to oppress minorities and women, but we have grown past that. And just as we have extended the sphere of our concern to those who once weren't included in it, now we need to take it a step further to the environment itself. So when we engage in practices such as forestry, we need to look at trees not as simply things we farm. We need to see trees as part of an ecosystem, part of a living whole that has its own value inherent to it. And Leopold comes to a point in the essay where he says this, that something is right when it tends to promote the beauty, integrity, and stability of the environment, and is wrong when it tends otherwise. And notice how strong that statement is. It's a very strong environmental ethic that suggests that when we make a decision, we should consider first what's going to be the harm that's going to happen. What's going to be the impact not only to human beings but to the environment that exists already, the individual species that are out there. Now, he says, puts forth this what we call Leopold's Golden Rule. Why should we believe it? Well, we should believe it in no small part because of what he's described beforehand. That in order to understand the value of the environment, we have to be out in it. We have to learn it. We have to become intimately familiar with it, both as in a scientific way, but also in a personal way. And it's in that knowing the environment that we come to appreciate its value. And it's really a kind of experiential argument. There's some things you can only know by experiencing. And this seems to be what Leopold is suggesting. And note what this implies, that when we talk about nature's intrinsic value, we can talk about just the land. And so Leopold's article is called The Land Ethic in that book, The Sand County Almanac. But we might also think not simply in land, but also in terms of species, as individual species lines as having value. But perhaps also whole ecosystems, such as the Yellowstone ecosystem you see behind me, or the Great Barrier Reef. And so when we think about intrinsic value, these are things we should think about. What is it that has intrinsic value, and how do we measure that intrinsic value and weigh it against what are sometimes competing human interests?